I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro kept treading, till it seemed that sense was breaking through. And when they all were seated, a service, like a drum, kept beating, till I thought my mind was going numb. And then I heard them lift a box and creak across my soul, with those same boots of lead again, then space began to toll. As all the heavens were a bell, and being but an ear, and I, and silence, some strange race, wrecked, solitary, here. And then a plank in reason broke, and I dropped down, and hit a world at every plunge, and finished knowing then. Emily Dickinson's I Felt a Funeral in My Brain challenges the reader to mix realities between the physical, intellectual, and spiritual. The first line sets a distressing tone to the poem as the speaker claims that there is a funeral in her brain. This is an extended metaphor Dickinson uses for the duration of the poem. She could have opted for saying the speaker felt like there was a funeral in her brain, but to state that there is a funeral indicates an altered sense of reality in the speaker. This poem is another example of how Dickinson's work resembles church hymns that are traditionally written in rhyming quatrains with a regular rhythm. In this case, Dickinson opts for an A-B-C-B rhyme scheme and utilizes slant rhymes, like in the first stanza where she forces fro to rhyme with through. The final stanza of the poem actually doesn't rhyme at all. Dickinson writes the poem using iambic meter, where an unstressed syllable is followed by a stressed syllable and so on. Notice that it's not iambic pentameter, as that requires 10 syllables per line. Instead, this poem is an 8-6, which is an 8-syllable line followed by a 6-syllable line. Most noticeable about the poem right away is Dickinson's use of unconventional capitalization. Many words in the middle of lines are capitalized, adding to the frenzied nature of the speaker's mind. Aside from Dickinson's use of the extended metaphor, she employs other literary devices to cast a dreary and hopeless mood for the reader. The repetition of treading, in line 3, broken by an em dash, slows down the reading of the poem and envelops the reader in the melancholic reality the speaker is living in. This is repeated once more in line 7 with beating, again slowing down the reading of the poem. To further understand the nuances of the poem, it is important to be aware of the emotional state of the poet painting this somber setting. Born in 1830 in Massachusetts, Emily Dickinson was a poet that wrote from isolation and was an exception for women of her era. She was born into a prominent family and was privileged enough to attend school, which she ended up leaving due to her fragile emotional state. Dickinson never married and rarely left the house. Knowing a bit of Dickinson's background makes it possible to further analyze the poem with an added layer of meaning. The poem technically doesn't have a title. Dickinson didn't give a name to the majority of her work as she didn't want her writing to be published. It wasn't until she passed away and one of her sisters discovered Dickinson's journals that her poems became public. A recurring motif, not just in this poem, but the majority of Dickinson's work, is that of depression. Imagery of the speaker falling through reason represents a descent into hopelessness, hinted at throughout the poem as well by imagery of death. The funeral taking place in the speaker's mind represents the death of Dickinson's sanity. Because of the long trek of the funeral, we can infer that whatever led up to the death was drawn out and painful. In the first stanza, Dickinson wrote, "It seemed that sense was breaking through," which implies that the speaker felt she was making progress in improving her mental state. However, this idea is juxtaposed harshly against not only the act of the funeral, but also in the final stanza when Dickinson writes that a plank in reason broke, and the speaker dropped down and down into a heightened depression, the final descent into mental breakdown. Dickinson describes all of the ceremonial aspects having to do with a funeral, yet never mentions the body being buried, and she writes no distinction between the brain and the mind. Notice how she describes the funeral taking place in her brain. The speaker physically feels the creaking of the boots of lead and hears the beating of the drum. There is no funeral actually taking place in the physical brain, but the speaker's altered sense of reality leads her to believe there is. Dickinson's life was characterized by depression and solitude. She ended the poem with a dash, so in essence it has no real end, just as Dickinson's mental anguish had no end. This poem is just one example of the emotional distress Dickinson lived through, and which she wrote about in her poetry. It's pieces like this that inspired other writers to use English and poetry as a means of survival and coping.